The drizzle had settled into a fine mist by the time Inspector Purbright left the station. He disliked the feel of wet tweed, yet there was something fitting about rain on a day when people fainted at flower shows. The streets around the town hall were still dotted with paper cups, petals, and damp bunting, all of which lent Flaxborough an air of minor disarray, a state it rarely tolerated for long. When Purbright entered the marquee, most of the exhibitors had gone home, leaving behind their trophies and whispered grievances. The air smelled of chrysanthemums and disinfectant. Sergeant Love was talking to a thin man with a face like a discontented owl. "Mr. Fudge, town clerk," he introduced. "He found the spectacles after Mrs. Arbuthnot's spell." "Spell?" Purbright echoed mildly. "You mean faint?" Mr. Fudge cleared his throat. "Quite so, Inspector. Though, if I may say, it had an atmosphere, well, supernatural." He gestured at the empty chair as though it retained a trace of tragedy. "Never seen so much fuss about a pair of spectacles." Purbright bent to inspect the spot where they had been discovered. The ground sheet was clean except for a faint, circular mark of damp soil. "Did anyone move this chair before your constable arrived?" "Only to let the lady breathe," said Fudge. "We're civic-minded here." "I've noticed," Purbright murmured. He straightened, gazing toward the judge's table, where a small brown stain darkened the cloth. "And who sat there?" "The optician fellow, Blee," Love supplied. "Had a stall displaying antique frames. Seemed all right when he came in. Was he here when Mrs. Arbuthnot fainted?" "Not that anyone recalls, sir. Might have slipped out before." Purbright looked toward the tense flap, now flapping idly in the breeze. Let's hope he simply found something more interesting than dahlias. Outside, the fairground organ was still grinding out a melancholy waltz for no one. A paper rosette, half crushed, lay by the path. Purbright stooped to pick it up, turning it over in his hand. On the back, written in pencil, were the initials H.H. He pocketed it without comment. As he crossed the square, Mrs. Arbuthnot's voice called faintly from the ambulance, where she reclined like a martyr to horticulture. "Inspector, I'm sure it was the excitement," she insisted. "But such dreadful spectacles. Quite gory." "Gory?" "Positively crimson," she said, shuddering delicately. "And that smell burnt fabric, I think. Awful." Purbright thanked her kindly and closed the ambulance door himself. The drizzle had become rain again, a soft, persistent patter. He paused beneath the town hall clock, watching the second hand drag its patient circle, and thought of the smear within the spectacle's lens, of Blee's empty shop on the high street, and of the neatness with which gossip replaced fact in this town. He turned his collar up and began to walk toward the optician's premises, unhurried, the faint gleam of curiosity in his eyes, the kind that, in Flaxborough, often meant something quietly troubling had begun. By morning, the drizzle had lifted, but in Flaxborough the fog of speculation hung thicker than ever. The Citizen's revised headline, "Minor Mishap Mars, Marigold Triumph," had only deepened the mystery. At Perkins' tea rooms, every table was occupied by patrons discussing precisely what the paper had failed to mention. Mrs. Prothero, flushed with moral superiority, claimed that Mrs. Arbuthnot had been poisoned by her own cucumber sandwiches. Mrs. Vintner countered that it was a case of nerves brought on by guilt, though no one could say of what. At the police station, Sergeant Love read the newspaper aloud with grave importance. "The police," he quoted, "have made no statement." "That's you, sir." Purbright, pouring milk into his tea, looked up mildly. Always good to have one's silence acknowledged. He added a second lump of sugar and stirred. "Any sign of Mr. Blee?" "Not yet, sir." "Shop still locked?" "Neighbour says he's been gone since yesterday afternoon. He's got a house out by the allotments, but curtains drawn there too." "Perhaps he's taken ill," Purbright said thoughtfully. "Or perhaps someone thought he had." He stood and reached for his coat. "We'll pay a call." As they walked up High Street, Purbright noted how the townsfolk's greetings carried a new tone, half conspiratorial, half gleeful. Even the milkman paused mid-delivery to remark, "Terrible business, Inspector. Blood all over, I heard." "Not quite all over," Purbright replied, and moved on before the man could elaborate. Mr. Blee's optician's shop was a narrow affair squeezed between the haberdashery and a fishmonger's. Its window display was a regiment of spectacles upon plastic faces, all staring outward with unnerving composure. The sign on the door read, "Closed for inventory," written in a shaky hand. Purbright unlocked it with the constable's borrowed skeleton key and stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of metal polish and damp wool. On the counter sat an unfinished cup of tea, surface film hardened, beside an open ledger. Purbright examined the last entry, prescription 147, special lenses urgent. The initials beside it, HH, were the same as those on the rosette in his pocket. He moved to the back room. A chair was overturned, and on the floor lay a torn scrap of fabric, part of a waistcoat lining. Love bent to pick it up. "Blood here too, sir. Tiny spot." "Tiny spots often belong to large stories," Purbright murmured. He straightened the chair, then glanced toward a small framed photograph on the wall. Blee shaking hands with Councillor Harcourt at last year's flower show. Odd company for a humble optician. As they left, a small crowd had already gathered outside, sensing something worth observing. Mrs. Prothero was among them, fanning herself theatrically. "You found him, then?" she asked hopefully. "Not yet," said Purbright, locking the door. "But I suspect he'll turn up," she sniffed. "Dead, you mean?" Purbright gave her a courteous nod. "If so, Mrs. Prothero, it will be the first time gossip has proved accurate in this town." Her mouth fell open, and for once no reply came. As Purbright walked back toward the station, the faint smile playing on his lips suggested he had heard something more revealing in the morning's chatter than most would ever guess. Inspector Purbright preferred to visit people when they least expected it, not from deceit, but because the truth in Flaxborough tended to hide behind rehearsed manners. That afternoon he made his way to the Arbuthnot's residence, a square house that looked as though it had been built to withstand both weather and opinion. Mrs. Arbuthnot received him from a chaise longue, wrapped in a shawl and a sense of personal tragedy. "Inspector," she sighed, "I do hope this dreadful business isn't to drag on. My nerves won't permit it." "I assure you, madam," Purbright replied kindly, "I hope for the same." He took the chair nearest the fireplace. "You mentioned yesterday that you smelled something burning at the flower show." She nodded gravely. A singed sort of odour, distinctly unpleasant. "I remember thinking someone had knocked over a candle, though there were no candles, of course." "Of course," Purbright murmured, eyes flicking to the silver cup gleaming on the mantel. "Did you happen to see Mr. Blee before your fainting spell?" "Mr. Blee?" she repeated, as if the name were an obscure botanical specimen. "Oh, the optician." "Yes, I believe he was near the tent flap, speaking rather animatedly to Councillor Harcourt." "About what, I couldn't say." "It didn't look friendly." Purbright inclined his head. "You noticed their tone?" "Well, one couldn't help it," she said, with relish. Harcourt's face was crimson. "I thought he might burst a vessel." "He's terribly touchy about money matters, you know." "Always borrowing subscriptions before they're due," Purbright smiled faintly. "And Mr. Blee?" "Pedantic little man," she said, "but honest. Too honest for his own comfort, if you ask me." He thanked her and left her to her convalescence, stepping back into the pale sunlight of the street. The town seemed to hold its breath whenever he passed. Curtains twitched, conversations faltered, then resumed in whispers. At the corner by the post office, the editor of the Citizen was waiting with a folded newspaper and an air of injured innocence. "Inspector." "A word?" he said, lowering his voice. Purely civic interest. "Is it true there's blood at the optician's?" "There's been blood almost everywhere lately," Purbright said pleasantly. "Mostly in the newspapers," the man flushed. "Public has a right to know." "Indeed," said Purbright. "Though not necessarily to guess," he walked on. leaving the editor speechless and faintly alarmed. Outside Blee's locked shop again, Purbright paused to study the reflection in the window, the rows of artificial faces staring back, unblinking. He noticed a faint smear on the inside of the glass, near the handle, as if someone had pressed a hand there recently. Not blood this time, but soot. He made a small note in his pocketbook. "Sir?" Sergeant Love approached, slightly breathless. "Harcourt's been asking if you'd care to see him. Says he's got information." "People often do when they're nervous," Purbright said. "Let's not keep him waiting." The counsellor's office above the drapery shop was richly furnished, as though guilt might be smothered in velvet. Harcourt rose at their entrance, his smile the kind reserved for tax collectors. "Inspect a dreadful thing at the show." Poor Mrs. Arbuthnot shaken to the core. "You don't suspect foul play, I hope?" Purbright's expression remained mild. "At present I suspect very little and hope even less." He glanced at the counsellor's ink-stained fingers. "You knew Mr. Blee, I gather?" "Casually," Harcourt said too quickly. He handled spectacles for the committee, trifles, repairs. "Ah, reliable man?" "Reliable to a fault," Harcourt muttered, then caught himself. "Meaning punctual, of course." Purbright smiled. "Punctuality can be dangerous in some trades." "Thank you, counsellor. I won't trouble you further yet." Outside again, he lit a cigarette, the match flaring briefly in the breeze. "Love," he said softly, "find out what dealings Harcourt's committee had with Blee last month, and check the allotments by Blee's house. See if our optician planted anything unusual." "Unusual, sir?" Purbright exhaled a thin line of smoke. "Yes, the sort of crop one doesn't expect to grow back." The following morning brought a deceptive calm to Flaxborough. The air smelled of wet earth and optimism, both misleading conditions for any investigation. At the station, Sergeant Love was already armed with the day's theories, most of them borrowed from townsfolk and none of them useful. "Sir," he began eagerly, "Councillor Harcourt called again. Says he's certain there's no cause for alarm. Thinks Blee's gone to visit his sister in Whitby. Left in a hurry, perhaps after cutting himself while packing." Purbright looked up from the spectacles lying on his blotter. Did Harcourt also explain why Mr. Blee locked his shop, left his tea unfinished, and failed to inform his assistant? Love hesitated. "He didn't go into that." "No," Purbright said mildly. "I imagine he didn't." He replaced the spectacles in their paper wrapping. It's remarkable how tidy explanations arrive when people wish to stop thinking. Love frowned, unsure if this was agreement or rebuke. "You don't think he's just gone off, sir?" "People do." "True," Purbright admitted, "though they rarely go off leaving a smear of someone else's blood on their lenses." Love shuffled a paper. "Could be his own, sir." Purbright smiled faintly. "Yes, and perhaps his handkerchief burned itself in sympathy." The sergeant reddened. Still the council's jumpy about publicity. Harcourt asked if we might, quote, "quietly drop the matter unless a body turns up." "A policy which has much to recommend it," Purbright said dryly. "Fewer bodies that way." He stood, stretching his arms. "Let's visit Miss Chalmers at the shop. She might tell us more about her employer's travel plans or lack thereof." Miss Chalmers received them stiffly, her hands folded so tightly the knuckles shone white. "Mr. Blee was in good spirits that morning," she said. "He'd finished a special order, something to do with tinted lenses." "Said it was for an important customer. Harcourt, perhaps?" asked Purbright. She blinked. "I don't think so, sir. He said the client paid in cash. But he did mention the council dinner." "Did he?" Purbright asked, his tone so neutral it nearly disappeared. "Yes, sir. He said he was tired of certain people pretending not to see what's in front of their noses." Purbright nodded thoughtfully. "That can be exhausting." He thanked her and left her behind the counter, gazing after them with unease. Outside the morning had turned sharp and bright, the kind of light that flattened the town's respectable facades. Love cleared his throat. "Could still be nothing, sir. Maybe Harcourt's right." "The man's gone to Whitby, lost his glasses, cut his hand." "Possible," said Purbright, walking slowly. "Conveniently possible." I find convenience suspicious, don't you? Sometimes, Love admitted. But we've no evidence of a crime. True again, Purbright said, pausing before the notice board outside the citizen's office. A fresh poster announced, "No foul play in flower show incident, police say." Purbright regarded it with polite detachment. Interesting, he murmured.
I wasn't aware we'd said anything, the sergeant scowled.
They've printed it on their own. Then perhaps we've saved them the trouble of asking questions, Purbright said lightly. We mustn't spoil the town's sense of order.
Love. People prefer their mysteries solved, especially when they aren't. They turned the corner toward the high street,
passing a lamp-post plastered with bills for the upcoming council centenary banquet. Purbright stopped to read the small print. Guest of honour, he said quietly. Councillor Harcourt.
I suspect he'd rather not have an empty seat at his table reminding him of anyone absent. Love looked uneasy. You think Harcourt's hiding something? I think, Purbright replied, he's tidying something.
And I dislike tidy men in untidy circumstances. By late afternoon, the town had begun to settle back into its customary rhythm of mild scandal and overcooked lunches. The citizens' premature declaration of no foul play had restored a sense of civic comfort, always dangerous in Purbright's experience. He sat at his desk, the spectacles before him under a slant of cold window light. Their lenses, though wiped clean, still caught the faintest reddish shadow deep at the rim. He turned them slowly, then stopped, frowning. The smear wasn't on the outer surface at all. It gleamed faintly beneath the glass, inside, between lens and frame. That meant the blood had entered while the spectacles were worn, not handled. Purbright leaned back, steepling his fingers. Curious, he murmured. Sergeant Love looked up from his paperwork. Sir? Nothing yet, Purbright said. But I wonder what one must be doing to get blood inside one's spectacles, Love shrugged. Could have sneezed near a cut, sir. Possibly, Purbright allowed. Or possibly not. There's something else. He pointed to a dull scorch mark along the metal hinge.
See, he did.
Enough to warp the rim slightly, yet no candle or flame nearby when we found them. Chemical reaction, maybe? Perhaps. But Mrs. Arbuthnot mentioned a burning smell before she fainted. She doesn't strike me as imaginative. Love scratched his head.
Could mean nothing. Yes, Purbright said quietly.
But nothing is often the best disguise something can find. He rose and crossed to the cabinet, taking out the small evidence envelope that held the paper rosette he'd found near the marquee. The pencil initials, H.H., still showed faintly. 2 appearances of the same initials in one day, he said. Once on a rosette, once in Blee's ledger. Coincidence would be untidy. Could stand for anything, Love said. Harold, Henry, half the men in town. True. But perhaps not half who burn handkerchiefs and vanish from flower shows. Purbright slipped on his coat and nodded toward the door. We'll visit the allotments. The ground there keeps secrets longer than people do. The allotments lay behind a row of modest cottages, a patchwork of sheds, leaky barrels and hopeful cabbages. A blackbird sang somewhere among the beans. Love trudged ahead, poking at the soil with a stick. Nothing much here, sir. Just compost heaps and tools. Purbright crouched by a rain barrel, examining the ash at its base. Among the grey flakes was a small, twisted object, metal, thin as a wire. He lifted it carefully with his penknife. It looked like the arm of a pair of spectacles, the rest fused by heat. Someone's been burning things, he said. Love frowned. Could have been rubbish. Purbright turned the fragment, watching the light glint across its charred surface. Rubbish rarely smells of polish and cloth, he sniffed faintly.
And yet there it is again.
Singed fabric. A door creaked open behind them. Mrs. Finch, the neighbour from 2 plots away, appeared in her gardening gloves, her face set in habitual curiosity.
Afternoon, Inspector.
You after our missing optician, I suppose. My husband says he's run off with that assistant of his. Does he indeed? Purbright said pleasantly. And what do you say, Mrs. Finch? She sniffed. I say men who spend their evenings in sheds aren't running anywhere. Purbright smiled faintly. Wise observation.
When did you last see Mr. Blee?
The day before the show. He was carrying a parcel, looked heavy. Told me it was for the council display. Smelled queer, though. Like burnt oil. He thanked her, pocketing the fragment of spectacles. As they walked back toward the road, Love said, "Doesn't prove anything, sir." "Could still be coincidence?" Purbright nodded. "Yes. But coincidences have a curious way of multiplying when left unexamined." He paused, gazing toward the grey roofs of the town beyond. "We'll call on Councillor Harcourt next. I expect he'll have something freshly convenient to say." Councillor Harcourt received them in his study that evening, a room lined with heavy curtains and the faint medicinal scent of furniture polish. He rose with exaggerated cheerfulness when Purbright entered, as though greeting a distant cousin rather than the local police.
"Inspector."
"I do wish this business with Blee would resolve itself. The town thrives on rumours and, well, rumours thrive on you." Purbright smiled mildly. "Then I must be careful not to overfeed them." He accepted the chair Harcourt offered, glancing about the room. A single lamp burned low, casting shadows across a framed certificate from the Town Improvement Society. "You've been busy with the council's centenary arrangements, I believe?" Harcourt's smile tightened. "A tremendous amount of work, yes. All voluntary, of course."
"One can't neglect civic duty." "Indeed not," said Purbright.
"I'm told Mr. Blee was helping with certain display items for the dinner. Glasswork, perhaps?" The councillor hesitated a moment too long. "Yes, well, he was to provide some decorative lenses, purely symbolic." "Symbolic of what?"
"Vision," Harcourt said promptly, then flushed.
"Civic vision, you know."
"A metaphor," Purbright nodded gravely. "Ah, yes."
"A rare commodity." He rose and inspected a small brass wastebin beside the desk. At its bottom lay several scraps of burned paper, one corner still showing the letterhead of Flaxborough Optical Services. "Metaphors can be flammable, I see." Harcourt's voice hardened.
"Is this an interrogation, Inspector?"
"Merely curiosity, Councillor. You'd be surprised how often it clears the air." Purbright replaced the lid and smiled pleasantly. "By the way, I believe these initials, HH, appear frequently in Mr. Blee's records. You wouldn't know to whom they refer." Harcourt's hand strayed toward his collar. "No idea." "Must be coincidence." "Of course," said Purbright softly. "Coincidence does have such excellent timing." They left him soon after, Harcourt's false geniality lingering in the hall like cheap perfume. Outside, the lamps along the street flickered to life, their reflections stretching in puddles.
Love exhaled. "He's lying, sir."
"You could see it?" "Yes," Purbright said, "but the value lies in how he lied, carefully, as though rehearsed. That means he's frightened, but not yet desperate." They walked toward the river road, where the buildings grew smaller and less self-important. The optician's house stood dark, save for a faint light from the upper window. Purbright tapped at the door. Miss Chalmers appeared after a pause, her face pale above a cardigan 2 sizes too large. "Inspector," she said nervously, "I didn't expect— Has there been news?"
"Not quite."
"May we come in?" The sitting room smelled faintly of lavender polish and loneliness. Purbright's eyes moved over the mantel photographs. Blee with various civic groups. Blee beside a younger man with similar features. And one recent portrait of him standing in front of the flower show marquee. "Your employer had family?"
Purbright asked. "Only a nephew, sir."
"Lives up north somewhere." "They weren't close." "And you last saw him the morning before the show?" "Yes, he was anxious. Said he'd been threatened."
"I told him to speak to you, but he laughed."
"Said the police would only ask who deserved to be embarrassed." Purbright regarded her steadily. "Did he say by whom?" She shook her head. "Only that it was someone respectable." "Flaxborough is full of those," Purbright said quietly. He noticed a receipt tucked under the mantel clock and drew it out. It was for a parcel posted to an address in Lincoln, dated the day of the flower show. The addressee was simply marked H.H. Town Hall. He slipped it into his pocket, thanked Miss Chalmers, and stepped back into the cool night. The church clock struck 8, the sound echoing faintly down the narrow street. Love looked puzzled. "You think Harcourt sent that parcel to himself?"
"Perhaps," Purbright said.
Or perhaps someone wanted him to think so.
Either way, the initials have stopped being coincidence. As they walked toward the station, the inspector's tone softened, almost reflective.
It's odd, love. The longer one looks at Flaxborough, the more it resembles those spectacles, cracks inside.
None visible from the surface. The following morning broke with a clarity that made even Flaxborough's rooftops look freshly scrubbed.
Purbright, however, regarded it as the sort of deceptive brightness that follows something unpleasant. He was halfway through his first cup of tea when Sergeant Love entered, flushed from the chill air and importance. "Sir, Gardner from the vicarage just came in. Says he's found something in the allotments behind the church." Purbright set down his cup.
Something or someone? Something, sir.
"Says it's a bit of cloth, burned, and what might be blood." "Ah," said Purbright, rising. "A modest discovery, but perhaps a growing one." They reached the vicarage within 10 minutes. The gardener, Mr. Pike, stood beside his wheelbarrow like a man defending property. He pointed to a small heap of weeds near the compost pit. "There it is, Inspector. Dug it up this morning." "Didn't smell like ordinary rubbish," Purbright crouched. Half buried in damp soil lay a handkerchief, scorched through its centre, the edges blackened and brittle. He lifted it carefully with his penknife, turning it over in the light. The fabric was fine, too fine for gardening, and faintly stained a dull brown. Embroidered in one corner, still visible despite the burns, were the initials H. H. Love gave a low whistle. Same as the ledger and the rosette. "Consistency can be comforting," Purbright murmured, slipping the handkerchief into a paper envelope. "Did you notice anything else, Mr. Pike?" The gardener scratched his neck. "Only a bit of ash in the barrel yonder. Looked like paper to me, melted clean. And a smell, sir, like something chemical." "Chemical?" "Yes, sir. Like the Polish they use at the town hall. My brother works there, says you can smell it halfway down the corridor." Purbright straightened slowly. "Then perhaps our civic pride is spreading itself rather widely." He thanked Pike and walked a few paces toward the boundary wall. From there, one could see the back gate of the town hall, little more than 50 yards away through the trees. "Convenient place for disposing of things discreetly," he observed. Love followed his gaze. "You think Harcourt came this way? Or sent someone who did? But either way, he's beginning to leave a trail, and not a very tidy one." Back at the station, Purbright laid the handkerchief beside the spectacles. The two objects, side by side, seemed to hold a quiet conversation of their own. He studied them for a long moment, then spoke without looking up.
"Send this to the lab, Love. Tell them not to hurry."
"I want to see how much time the counsellor thinks he still has," Love hesitated.
"You think he'll panic?"
"No," said Purbright. "He'll bluster. Panic requires imagination." The rest of the morning passed with the slow accumulation of small details. A clerk from the post office confirmed that Blee's parcel to H.H. had never left town. It was collected, not posted. A milk boy swore he'd seen Councillor Harcourt walking toward the river on the evening of the flower show, carrying a parcel wrapped in brown paper. When asked how he could be sure, he replied, "Because Mr. Harcourt tipped me to forget it." By late afternoon, a pale wind swept across the market square, lifting old notices from the railings. Purbright stood watching the fluttering paper as though it were a sort of confession. Love approached, report in hand. "No word from the lab yet, sir." "That's all right," said Purbright.
"I'd rather the town stayed comfortable a little longer."
Comfort loosens tongues. As they turned back toward the station, church bells began to ring for evening practice. The notes carried thinly over the rooftops, bright and hollow. Purbright paused, listening.
"Do you hear that, Love? Always the same tune, yet never quite the same sound." Love frowned.
"Meaning, sir?" "Meaning?" Purbright said softly. "Someone in this town is playing the wrong note and pretending not to notice." Evening had settled over Flaxborough like a worn velvet curtain, softening edges but not concealing them. From his office window, Purbright watched the street lamps bloom one by one in the drizzle, their halos blurring like half-forgotten thoughts. The town below seemed utterly content with itself, a complacency he found both enviable and suspicious. He turned from the window and regarded the modest collection of evidence laid neatly on his desk. The spectacles, the burned handkerchief, the rosette, the half-melted frame. Each object, harmless alone, together hinted at the same quiet ugliness that thrived wherever people preferred comfort to truth. He had learned long ago that Flaxborough's wickedness rarely came wrapped in violence. It came in the form of small dishonesties politely exchanged, a handshake concealing a theft, a smile hiding a threat. The desk clock ticked with exaggerated civility. Purbright leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. He thought of Councillor Harcourt, his anxious precision, his eagerness to tidy away discomfort, and of poor Mr. Blee, whose obsession with accuracy might have led him into the wrong kind of arithmetic. Somewhere between them lay the truth, neatly balanced like a ledger's final line. He imagined the scene as it might have begun, a disagreement over accounts, a warning disguised as courtesy, a single moment when anger triumphed over civility. No shouts, no struggle, just a sudden, regrettable act committed under the pretense of moral indignation. The kind of act Flaxborough would prefer to forget before it had properly happened. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Sergeant Love entered, hat in hand.
"Tea, sir."
"Thought you might like one before locking up." Purbright accepted it with a nod.
"Thank you, love. Quiet evening?" "As quiet as it gets."
Though the gossip's louder than the bells tonight. Harcourt's name's being whispered in every shop. Purbright stirred his tea thoughtfully. That's the trouble with respectable men. They make such excellent scandals. People enjoy watching them slip. Love hesitated. "Do you really think Harcourt's our man?" "I think," Purbright said slowly, "he's a man who mistakes silence for safety. But silence only works when everyone agrees to it. And in Flaxborough, people never quite manage to." The sergeant looked puzzled, but accustomed enough to his superior's method not to ask further. He lingered by the door. "If it helps, sir, I've checked the town hall ledgers. One of the accounts for the centenary fund shows a withdrawal signed by Harcourt himself."
£200 marked for decorative expenses. No receipts. 200, Purbright repeated.
"Enough to make a man nervous if someone noticed," Love nodded. Blee might have done. He kept the council's invoices for their display orders. "Yes," said Purbright quietly. And he had a conscience tidy enough to mention it aloud. After Love had gone, Purbright remained seated, his tea growing cold. Outside, a faint wind rattled the sash. The inspector's gaze drifted to the filing cabinet where the evidence rested. He imagined again the faint smudge within the spectacles, the burned initials, the scent of singed fabric hanging in the air of the flower tent. Such clues were never random. They were the nervous fingerprints of guilt trying to disguise itself as accident. He reached for his coat and extinguished the lamp, leaving the office in near darkness, save for the dim glow of the streetlight outside. As he closed the door, he murmured to no one in particular, "People never mean to kill, not in Flaxborough. They just tidy a little too thoroughly." By the next afternoon, Purbright had decided the time had come for politeness to do its work. In Flaxborough, questions asked too directly were considered vulgar. The truth, he knew, was best coaxed out under the guise of civility. He instructed Sergeant Love to arrange a brief informal chat at the station with 3 people: Councillor Harcourt, Miss Chalmers, and Mrs. Arbuthnot. "No statements," he said. "Just tea, conversation, and a little discomfort." At precisely 3 o'clock, the trio arrived separately, each feigning calm. Purbright greeted them with unhurried warmth, ushering them into the small interview room, now arranged to resemble a church tea. A tray of cups and a plate of dry biscuits occupied the centre table. The inspector's tone was mild enough to seem harmless, which was precisely the point. "I do appreciate your coming," he began. We're almost at the end of this tiresome affair.
A few details remain. Trivial ones, I assure you. He poured tea for each, noting Harcourt's trembling hand as he accepted his cup.
Now, you were all at the flower show, I believe. Mrs. Arbuthnot nodded primly. Indeed, Inspector, I still feel the strain of it. And you, Councillor? Harcourt cleared his throat. Of course. I presided over the prizes. A proud day for Flaxborough, Purbright smiled faintly. Yes, though pride, like marigolds, doesn't always survive handling. He turned to Miss Chalmers. Your employer, Mr. Blee, also attended. He was seen speaking with the councillor shortly before your unfortunate faint, Mrs. Arbuthnot. The woman stiffened.
I told you that, Inspector.
Though I wouldn't say I heard anything. Just as well, said Purbright. Words can be misleading. Actions, on the other hand, are admirably plain. He placed the spectacles on the table. You recognize these, Miss Chalmers? Her eyes flickered. Mr. Blee's always kept them spotless. Quite, said Purbright.
Spotless until recently.
The mark inside the lens suggests he was looking closely at something, or someone, when blood spattered inward. You understand what that implies? Harcourt shifted in his chair. You're insinuating violence, Inspector, without proof. Not at all, Purbright said pleasantly. Merely observing physics? The inward spatter, you see, comes from facing the source.
One rarely bleeds on oneself from behind. Mrs. Arbuthnot gave a little gasp.
Miss Chalmers looked down. Harcourt forced a laugh that sounded like glass cracking. Accidents happen, Inspector. Blee was clumsy.
Perhaps he cut himself? Ah, yes, Purbright said softly.
And afterward took the trouble to burn his handkerchief and misplace his spectacles?
Admirably composed for a bleeding man, he leaned back. Tell me, Councillor, did your committee ever pay Mr. Blee for his decorative lenses?
Harcourt hesitated. The records were delayed. He preferred cash. Convenient for both, Purbright murmured. And this anonymous donor for the flower show prize money, were those initials yours as well? The councillor's jaw twitched.
I beg your pardon?
Purbright smiled gently. H.H. on the rosette, the ledger, the burned handkerchief. It seems civic generosity leaves quite the trail. Silence pooled around the table.
Even the teacups seemed to listen.
Harcourt's breathing quickened, his eyes darting toward the door, as if politeness itself had become a trap. Purbright waited, unmoving. At last, the councillor spoke, voice trembling with strained composure. I've nothing more to say, Inspector. If you require statements, you may write to my solicitor. As you wish, Purbright said mildly, rising. But do take care crossing the square, Councillor. It's very easy to trip when one's conscience is uneven. Harcourt left without another word. Mrs. Arbuthnot followed in flustered silence. Only Miss Chalmers lingered.
Inspector, she said softly, he's frightened. I think he's done something terrible, Purbright nodded.
Yes, Miss Chalmers. And now that fear has made him clumsy, he'll show us precisely what. When she'd gone, he stood a moment in the quiet room, the faint scent of tea and guilt mingling in the air. Sometimes, he said to himself, the truth doesn't need to be found, it simply needs an audience. 2 days later, Flaxborough wore its usual mask of respectability, though a faint tremor of unease rippled beneath it. Councillor Harcourt had been seen little since his visit to the station. When he did appear, it was in brief, harried flashes, a man avoiding his own shadow. Purbright, meanwhile, continued his work with quiet efficiency, speaking to no one of consequence, asking nothing further. He simply waited, as patience was often more persuasive than pressure. By Friday afternoon, Harcourt could stand the silence no longer. He appeared unannounced at the station, hat clutched too tightly in one hand, defiance hanging by a thread. I won't have my name dragged through speculation, Inspector, he began. The council is whispering, the press is sniffing. This has gone far enough. Purbright looked up from his papers.
Indeed it has, Councillor.
Do sit down. His voice was calm, almost courteous. Harcourt hesitated, then lowered himself into the chair opposite, trying to appear indignant rather than cornered. Purbright opened a folder and removed several photographs: the spectacles, the burned handkerchief, the ledger, the ash from the allotments. "Curious things, aren't they?" he said. "Each one tells a small story, but together quite a neat one." "I fail to see any connection," Harcourt snapped. "Oh, I think you do," Purbright replied softly. Mr. Blee kept meticulous records, dangerously meticulous for a man who noticed irregular withdrawals in the Centenary Fund.
He mentioned it to you at the flower show, didn't he?
Perhaps lightly, perhaps with too much honesty. I imagine it wasn't a pleasant conversation. Harcourt's lips tightened. "You can't prove any of this?" "I don't need to," said Purbright, his tone mild as ever. "You've already done it." The blood inside the spectacles shows Blee was facing his attacker, someone close enough to speak quietly. The scorch on the frame suggests the vase that struck him contained burning alcohol, part of the flower display. "You knocked it over in the struggle, which explains the smell Mrs. Arbuthnot noticed before she fainted."
"And afterward you panicked. That's absurd, is it?"
Purbright leaned forward slightly. "You burned the handkerchief to remove traces of blood and embroidered initials. Unfortunately, vanity made you use your own, HH, the same ones Blee noted in his ledger. You buried the rest behind the vicarage, thinking the allotments unobserved. But Flaxborough watches everything, Councillor, just not at the right time." The councillor's face had gone pale, his eyes fixed on the envelope in Purbright's hand. "There's no body," he said hoarsely.
"Yet without that you have nothing." "True," Purbright admitted.
"But the river has a habit of returning things people think they've hidden. The constable dredged it this morning, quite by accident, near the mill sluice. He placed a small photograph on the desk, a blurred image of a pale hand, the curve of a broken frame beside it. Mr. Blee was never far from home. For a long moment Harcourt said nothing. His hand twitched once, then stilled. When he spoke, it was barely a whisper. He wouldn't listen.
"I only meant to warn him. It was an accident." Purbright regarded him with quiet pity.
"Most murders are. But the tidying afterward rarely is." Harcourt lowered his head into his hands. The inspector signalled to Love, who entered silently from the adjoining office. "The councillor would like to make a statement," Purbright said. "He's ready now." When they were alone again, Purbright turned to the window. Outside, the late sunlight glowed weakly over the square, gilding the rooftops as though nothing in the world had changed. Yet, as always in Flaxborough, something had, though only slightly, and never enough to show. The confession came quietly, written in Harcourt's careful accountant's script, as though neatness might still redeem him. He signed each page with a trembling flourish, then asked if he might telephone his wife before being taken away. Purbright permitted it. Flaxborough was not unkind to its sinners, only disappointed. Outside, rain had begun again, steady and unhurried. The inspector watched through the office window as the constable led Harcourt to the waiting car. The councillor's umbrella turned briefly inside out in the wind, a final indignity that no one commented upon. People in the square pretended not to notice, though every face half-turned as he passed. Respectability in Flaxborough had an excellent memory but no sympathy. By the following morning, the Citizen published its account with practised restraint. Local councillor assists police in inquiry. No mention of arrest. No word like murder, only a civic sigh of embarrassment. The column opposite praised the town's unshaken sense of dignity. Purbright, reading it over tea, murmured, "Nothing reassures quite like a lie told politely." At the station, Sergeant Love reported that the body had been formally identified by Miss Chalmers. She had wept, then apologized for the inconvenience. Purbright had expected no less. The girl would leave town soon, he thought.
As all honest people eventually did. Mrs. Arbuthnot, meanwhile,
had written to say she was most relieved the unpleasantness was over and would be hosting a tea to celebrate the reformation of the Flower Show Committee. It was, in its way, the purest act of civic recovery. That afternoon, Purbright walked through the marketplace, its usual chatter restored. Stall holders called out greetings, children squabbled by the fountain, and the church clock tolled the hour with disinterested precision. The inspector paused outside Blee's shuttered shop. A small notice now hung in the window. Premises to let. Inquire within town hall. He regarded it for a long moment, then smiled faintly at the irony. Back at his desk, he opened his notebook and wrote a brief summary for the file. The phrases came easily, no dramatics, no philosophy. He ended simply: motivation, concealment of fraud, method impulsive, aftermath predictable. Then he closed the folder and placed it neatly on the shelf with the others. Love appeared at the door. "That all, sir?"
"For now," said Purbright. "There'll be another one along presently."
"There always is," the sergeant lingered. "Strange thing, though. All this trouble over £200. Purbright looked up, his expression thoughtful. "People will murder for less, Love. Not for money, really, but for fear of losing the appearance of decency. In Flaxborough, that's a greater crime than any in the books." Love nodded slowly, as if only half understanding, and left. Purbright remained alone, listening to the faint ticking of the clock and the soft patter of rain against the window. After a while he reached for another report, sharpened his pencil, and resumed his work, as though order itself depended on his calm persistence. Outside, the rain deepened, washing clean the square that had so recently hosted whispers, pride and guilt. The town, true to its nature, carried on exactly as before.